The first time I heard my grandfather mention Ouranopithecus, I thought he was simply making up stories again. Strange names, forgotten creatures, dusty memories pulled from old books. But then he opened a worn atlas, brushed his fingers over a faded map of northern Greece and whispered, "This is where it all might have begun. Long before Homo sapiens, even before Neanderthals." I leaned in closer, almost holding my breath. Back then, the hills of Macedonia weren't quiet. They were filled with dense forests, heavy branches, and shadows of something unknown. Huge oaks twisted their roots deep into the ground. Birdsong echoed from one canopy to another, and in the middle of it, moving slowly and silently, lived a creature barely anyone remembers today, Ouranopithecus macedoniensis. Nobody really knows how it looked in perfect detail. There aren't any full skeletons or artistic depictions to rely on, just a few jawbones, fragments of teeth, and pieces of skull. But what scientists do know is enough to raise goosebumps even now. Imagine a large ape, bigger than a chimpanzee, more robust than a bonobo, but unlike any primate that exists today. Instead of swinging freely from branch to branch like gibbons, or walking on knuckles like gorillas, this mysterious ape probably climbed slowly, carefully, with a cautious intelligence. They say its molar teeth were incredibly thick, the kind of teeth needed to crush hard nuts or dig into tough roots. It didn't run across open fields. It thrived in shaded forests. It didn't roar or hunt. It survived through patience and adaptation. What made it even more strange was something my grandfather called the face of man. When paleontologists studied those jawbones, they noticed features that looked surprisingly human-like. The overall shape wasn't like an orangutan or gorilla. It was flatter, more refined, and oddly modern. Some experts believe Ouranopithecus lived around 9 to 8 million years ago. To put that in perspective, Homo sapiens, us, didn't show up until about 300,000 years ago. That's not a small difference. That's like placing a tiny drop of water next to an entire ocean of time. Back then, Africa and Europe weren't separated in the same way they are today. There were stretches of land and shallow seas that made migration possible. Forests covered large parts of southern Europe. If you walked through those forests, you could hear cracking branches above you, as if something heavy was quietly moving through the trees. And if you waited silently, maybe you'd see an Ouranopithecus reach up for a thick branch and effortlessly pull itself upward, watching the world with eyes full of calm curiosity. One of the reasons this ape is so mysterious is because scientists still argue about where it fits in the evolutionary tree. Some believe it might be a very early relative of modern great apes. Others, and this is the part that still shocks me, believe it might be closely related to the earliest ancestors of humans. Yes, humans. Not Neanderthals, not Denisovans, but us. That means there's a possibility, just a possibility, that before Africa became the focus of early human evolution, something important might have started in Europe. My grandfather used to say, "Truth disappears faster than bones. That's why we need stories." He believed Ouranopithecus wasn't just an extinct ape. It was a reminder that our origin is far more complicated and mysterious than any one map or theory can explain. I remember asking him, "Why don't people talk about this more? Why aren't there statues or museums or books?" He smiled and replied, "Because it doesn't fit in a simple sentence, and most people only remember what's easy to understand." But even though scientists haven't unearthed a complete skeleton, they've found enough clues to paint a rough outline of its life. For example, the thickness of its teeth suggests a diet rich in hard, fibrous plants. The broadness of its jaw suggests powerful chewing muscles. The wear patterns on its molars suggest a long lifespan and slow development. Some paleoanthropologists say it might have lived in small groups. Others think it could have been more solitary. Nobody truly knows what they sounded like. Maybe gentle grunts, maybe soft hoots drifting through the twilight air. And yet, the fragments of its face still look so strangely familiar. When I look at the reconstructed jaw in one of the scientific diagrams, it doesn't scare me. It makes me wonder. What did it feel when rain began to fall across the leaves? Did it find comfort in the arms of another? Did it teach its young how to forage, how to avoid danger, how to survive? We'll probably never know. But I like to imagine a young Ouranopithecus sitting on a smooth rock, holding a cracked nut between both hands, studying it with a patient gaze, like it was trying to solve a puzzle. We humans often think we are the first to learn, the first to wonder, the first to feel curious about the world. But maybe, long before us, a different creature was already standing in the forest, watching the sunset with wide, reflecting eyes. Behind every fossil there is an untold story. A lifetime of journeys, generations of struggle, and somewhere, buried, between rock layers and gentle dust, lies the beginning of something we still don't fully understand. Some evenings, I imagine the forests of Greece coming alive again, the branches moving slowly, the distant sound of cracking wood, and in the fading light, a shadow moving high above, calm, slow, confident, blending into the leaves as if it belonged there more than any creature ever did. That shadow may belong to Ouranopithecus, the mysterious ape that stood at the doorway of humanity, then disappeared without a trace of goodbye. The strangest thing about Ouranopithecus isn't just that it existed. It's that for thousands of years, nobody even knew it had existed. In the peaceful hills near the city of Thessaloniki, farmers used to walk out early in the morning with their sheep and goats. The ground was rocky, dotted with patches of grass and old olive trees. Most of them never realized that beneath their feet lay millions of years of forgotten history. Pieces of bone, bits of enamel, tiny fragments of a creature lost in time, waiting silently below the soil like a secret. Sometimes, when the rain was heavy and the water washed away the top layer of dirt, small fossils would appear. People thought they were just broken animal bones. Some even believed they belonged to ancient dragons or mythical beasts from Greek legends. But then, in the late 1970s, a young paleontologist stepped into that same area with a notebook and a quiet determination. Her name was Dr. Eleni Koufos. And unlike everyone else, she didn't see just soil and rocks. She saw possibilities. She walked slowly, carefully scanning the ground. Most days she found nothing, just ordinary stones shaped by wind and time. But one afternoon, right as the sun dipped behind a low hill, she noticed something glinting under, a layer of dry grass. It was small, barely the size of a coin, but its shape made her freeze, a molar tooth. She picked it up, wiped away the dirt, and held it against the fading light. The edges were thick, the ridges were unusual. It didn't belong to any animal she knew in the region. So she placed it in a small cloth and marked the spot. What she didn't know at that moment was that she'd just discovered the first evidence of Ouranopithecus in nearly 8 million years. Over the next several months, Dr. Koufos returned again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes with a small team of students. They dug carefully, using brushes instead of shovels. The earth slowly gave up its secrets, a piece of jaw, another tooth, parts of a skull. Each new discovery pushed them further down a tunnel of mystery. They compared the fossils to modern apes. They checked the measurements again and again. And every time, the results pointed to the same conclusion. This wasn't a chimpanzee. It wasn't a gorilla. It was something different, something older, something close to the root of our own story. While papers were being written and academic, debates sparked across universities. An elderly shepherd named Nikolaos watched the excavations from a distance. One day, he offered them a small cup of coffee and said, People think these hills are empty, but you are proving they're full of memory. The more the scientists studied, the more mysterious Ouranopithecus became. CT scans of the teeth showed wear patterns that didn't match any modern ape diet. The jawbone had a sturdy, powerful design, but with a facial angle that seemed unexpectedly human-like. Some scholars suggested the creature might have walked partially upright on the ground when moving between trees. Others thought it might have used both trees and open spaces depending on the season, perhaps moving south in winter when food became scarce. But the most surprising theory came from the examination of the inner ear, a delicate structure that helps with balance and spatial awareness. When researchers compared it to that of modern apes, they found similarities that didn't fit neatly into any existing category. One report even noted that the semicircular canals, tiny loops in the ear, showed patterns closer to early hominins than to most great apes. If that's true, then somewhere in those Greek forests, 9 million years ago, an ape might have taken a careful step, not on all fours, but partially upright, just for a moment, just enough to change everything. It's strange how history works. We imagine grand events, huge discoveries, dramatic turning points, but sometimes the most important shift begins with a tiny tooth buried under the roots of an olive tree. My grandfather once took me to a hill not far from there. We stood quietly for a long time, listening to the wind move through the grass. And then he said, "People think evolution is a straight road, but it's really more like a forest path, twisting, turning, sometimes disappearing, then reappearing when you least expect it. The story of Ouranopithecus is exactly that, a hidden path, almost forgotten, then suddenly rediscovered by someone who believed in looking closer. It makes me wonder, how many other pieces of our origin are still buried somewhere, waiting for the right eyes to find them? Maybe right now, beneath an ordinary field or an old village road, another mysterious jawbone is sleeping under layers of dust. And one day, a curious child or a determined scientist might kneel down and uncover the next puzzle piece of who we really are. Because the truth is, we didn't arrive suddenly. We were shaped by countless creatures before us. Some famous, like Australopithecus, and some almost completely forgotten, like Ouranopithecus. But even if they're forgotten, they still live inside our story, like distant echoes traveling across deep time. And so, looking back at that lonely Greek hillside where it all started, I can almost hear the distant footsteps of a giant ape gently brushing against fallen leaves, walking its slow and cautious walk, unaware that millions of years later someone would place its tooth in a cloth and whisper, "This changes everything." The more I read about Ouranopithecus, the more I realized something strange. This mysterious ape didn't live in a stable, peaceful world. It lived at a time when everything around it was changing. 9 million years ago, the climate in Europe was starting to shift. The great forests that once stretched endlessly across Greece, Bulgaria, and parts of Turkey began to thin out. Rainfall became less predictable. Some streams dried up completely during the hot summer months, and slowly, quietly, cracks appeared in the green blanket of the ancient world. If you stood on a hill back then, you would still see trees, but not as dense as before. In between the forested areas, small patches of open woodland started to appear, grassy clearings, low shrubs, places where sunlight touched the ground for the first time in thousands of years. For a creature like Ouranopithecus, built for climbing, chewing tough plants, and moving slowly under shaded canopies, this change was both an opportunity and a threat. It meant new food sources might become available in more open areas. But it also meant that the safe, familiar forest was shrinking. Imagine an old male Ouranopithecus waking up one morning. Instead of thick fog and cool forest air, he feels warmer sunshine on his face. Instead of hearing only the rustle of leaves, He hears the distant calls of animals usually found in open spaces, horses, antelopes, maybe even large predators. Does he stay in the forest he knows? Or does he step out into the unfamiliar clearing to explore? That one decision, repeated by hundreds of individuals over many generations, might have shaped the path of their entire species. Some scientists believe this gradual shift from dense forests to more mixed environments could have encouraged different forms of movement. Climbing branches wasn't always enough. Sometimes a quick walk across an open patch was necessary to reach the next group of trees. Maybe at first they did it awkwardly, using all fours, stopping often to look around. But with time, some of them might have started balancing differently, putting more weight on their back limbs, lifting themselves a little higher, not walking fully upright yet, but experimenting. Adapting. This is why paleontologists pay such close attention to the inner ear fossils and limb proportions. Even the slightest change in balance and posture could suggest that Ouranopithecus was responding to a transforming world. One fascinating detail I read in a recent study was that the root structure of its molars shows a stress pattern linked to chewing harder foods, maybe unripe fruits, dry seeds, or even bark during times of scarcity. That means these apes weren't just passively living in their environment, they were fighting to stay alive when resources became limited. In those moments of scarcity, intelligence becomes a survival tool. The ability to remember where the last water source is. The ability to recognize which plants are safe to eat even when they look different in a new season. The ability to make small decisions that increase the chance of survival, not just for one individual, but for an entire group. My grandfather always told me, evolution doesn't reward the strongest. It rewards the most adaptable. So, sometimes I imagine a young mother Ouranopithecus standing at the edge of a clearing, holding her infant close. The air is hot. The old fruit trees behind her have already been picked clean. The only hope lies in the unknown, a line of low bushes across the clearing where nobody from her group has gone before. She hesitates. Then, with a deep breath, she steps out into the sunlight. It's just one step. But evolution is made of such steps, small, unnoticed movements that ripple across generations until they change everything. And this brings us to a breathtaking theory. Some researchers think that small populations of Ouranopithecus might have eventually migrated toward the southeast, following water sources and vegetation, moving closer and closer to what is now the Middle East and possibly even North Africa. If even a tiny group made that journey, they might have crossed paths with other early primates. They might have merged, interbred, or even given rise to entirely new lineages that continued adapting to new conditions. In other words, Ouranopithecus might not be just a lonely dead-end branch on the tree of life. It might be one of the first roots. A root buried so deeply in ancient time that most of it is still hidden. But its presence is what allowed later branches, like Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and eventually us, to grow. Of course, not everyone in the scientific community agrees with this. Some insist that the human story begins fully in Africa and that European apes like Ouranopithecus have no direct connection. But every time another fossil fragment is found in Greece or Bulgaria, the debate grows louder. One senior paleoanthropologist once wrote, "We cannot dismiss the possibility that a crucial chapter of human evolution occurred outside Africa. The evidence is simply too provocative." For me, the most powerful part of this debate isn't the answer. It's the mystery. Because it means the forests we walk through today may be echoing with ancient footsteps that belong to more than just animals. They belong to distant relatives, half ape, half something else, slowly adapting to a world on the brink of change. Sometimes, late at night, I close my eyes and imagine the sound of a young Ouranopithecus moving between trees, stopping at the edge of a grassy patch and gazing forward with quiet curiosity. Not afraid, not entirely confident. Just wondering, the same way we humans still do today. There's a small museum in northern Greece that hardly anyone visits. It doesn't have huge dinosaur skeletons or shiny gemstones. Instead, behind a glass case near the back, there's something far more ordinary, a fragment of a jaw just a few centimeters long and 3 worn molar teeth. Most people walk right past it. But if you stop and really look and imagine the forest, the heat, the strange half-forest, half-grassland landscape of 9 million years ago, that little piece of bone suddenly turns into the echo of a living creature. I remember standing there with my grandfather when I was little. I didn't understand why he brought me to such a quiet place. He leaned down and said, "Every fossil is a whisper. If you stay long enough, you can hear what it's trying to say." So I pressed my forehead against the glass and listened. At first, nothing, just silence. But after a few moments, I could picture it, the jaw moving slowly as the ape chewed a tough seed, the sound of leaves swaying above, a distant cry of another member of its group. It's strange how alive a broken bone can become when you allow your imagination to fill in the missing parts. Scientists are trying to do the same thing, but with data instead of imagination. They've taken high-resolution digital scans of those teeth and fed them into 3D modeling software. The models revealed microscopic scratches and pits, tiny marks left by whatever the ape was eating in its final years. By comparing those marks with the teeth of modern animals, researchers concluded that Ouranopithecus probably had a mixed diet: hard nuts and seeds in dry seasons, soft fruits during wetter months, rough vegetation, like bark or fibrous leaves, when food was scarce. That may not sound exciting, but it's actually one of the earliest signs of dietary flexibility in a large ape. In evolutionary terms, flexibility is everything. Rigid species disappear when the environment changes, but those who can switch their diet, adapt their behavior, and explore new areas, they survive. Some experts suggest that this very flexibility might have been the key step that eventually led to higher intelligence, because to be flexible, you have to learn. You have to remember which food is safe and which is poisonous. You have to observe the seasons and memorize patterns. You have to teach your young, which raises a captivating question. Did Ouranopithecus teach? Did older males show younger ones how to crack nuts on flat stones? Did mothers guide their infants toward safe leaves and fruit trees? We'll never find a fossil of a lesson. But we can look at tooth wear in young individuals and notice patterns that suggest they were eating similar foods to adults, as if someone had introduced those foods to them slowly and deliberately. One paleoanthropologist wrote, "The consistency in wear patterns among juvenile and adult individuals suggests an organized and likely learned feeding behavior rather than random consumption." That sentence gave me chills. A learned feeding behavior, which means teaching. And where there is teaching, there is some form of cultural transmission. Not culture in the way we think of art or music, but the most ancient kind, knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, so that survival becomes a shared effort. If that's true, then deep in those Greek forests, somewhere between the rustling leaves and the shifting shadows, a young Ouranopithecus once sat patiently, watching an elder demonstrate how to peel away the outer layer of a tough plant. He didn't know that this simple moment would one day lead, millions of years later, to a human child learning how to read a book, or build a fire, or tell a story. But that's what makes it so powerful. Evolution isn't a staircase. It's a chain of tiny lessons, stretched across time. Whenever I visit that tiny museum, I don't see a dead jawbone anymore. I see the beginning of teaching, the first spark of shared knowledge. Maybe that's where our humanity truly began. Not in tools or language or cities, but in the quiet act of one creature showing another how to survive. And so, the next time someone walks past that little display without stopping, I wish I could tap their shoulder and say, "Don't. Ignore the whisper. This is where the story of us might have begun." By now, you might be wondering something I wondered too. If Ouranopithecus was so important, why did it disappear? The truth is, it might not have disappeared in the way most people imagine. It may have simply moved, or more accurately, gradually shifted its range over thousands of years, step by step, across changing landscapes. You see, the environment of southern Europe didn't just change once and then settle. It kept changing. Each century brought subtle, almost invisible shifts. A few less trees here, a little more grass there, a new type of predator moving in, a favorite fruiting tree becoming increasingly rare. To a modern human, those shifts are almost impossible to notice in a single lifetime. But to a species living over tens of thousands of years, generation after generation, the changes are real and sometimes impossible to ignore. When the forest becomes thin enough that there are long stretches of open land between tree clusters, an ape has two choices: stay and risk starvation, or move and find a new place where its skills still offer an advantage. There's evidence that other mammals during this same period began migrating southward: antelopes, giraffids, even some species of rhinos. They followed rivers. They followed food. They followed the path of least resistance. So why wouldn't Ouranopithecus do the same? Imagine a small family group: an adult male, 2 females, 3 juveniles. One evening, while traveling to their usual fruit trees, they find the branches empty. No fruit, not even the seed husks left behind. The next day, they search further. Still nothing. Then, in the distance, they hear the sound of rushing water, a river they've never visited before. Do they go? Do they risk the unknown? Maybe one brave female takes the first step. Maybe she steps across a small stream and finds an untouched grove on the other side. Maybe the whole group follows. These are the tiny, almost unnoticeable steps that make up a migration, not a dramatic stampede across continents, but a slow, careful expansion of range over time, generation by generation. And here's the astonishing part. That gradual southward movement may have eventually brought some groups of Ouranopithecus out of Europe altogether, down through the eastern Mediterranean corridor, across ancient land bridges that no longer exist today, and into northern Africa, where another chapter of evolution was waiting to begin. Some paleoanthropologists call this the back to Africa hypothesis, the idea that a very early ancestor of humans might have originated in Eurasia and then moved back into Africa long before the more famous migrations of Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. It's still controversial. Not everyone accepts it, but every time a new fossil is discovered in Greece, Turkey, or Bulgaria, the hypothesis grows just a little stronger. One researcher once said, "We may be looking at a hidden migration event so deep in time, its traces have almost completely faded. Almost, but not entirely. Because even today, the oldest possible hominin fossils found in Europe and the Middle East share certain dental and facial features with Ouranopithecus. Not identical, but connected, like distant cousins on a family tree. It's as if Ouranopithecus left a faint fingerprint somewhere along the path, a tiny clue that says, we were here, we passed through. And that possibility changes the way I look at a map. When I trace my finger from northern Greece down toward the Levant and into Africa, I don't see borders or modern countries. I see a journey across deep time, a trail of survival, adaptation, and quiet courage. We usually tell our origin story as if it starts in one place and then spreads out. But what if it began as a circle? What if an ancient ape left Europe to enter Africa, and only millions of years later its descendants would leave Africa to explore the rest of the world again? A great loop of life and return. Sometimes, late at night, I sit with an old atlas and imagine that invisible migration. No crowds, no maps, just a series of careful steps, a lone figure crossing a dry riverbed, a juvenile climbing a new type of tree and tasting a fruit no ancestor had tasted before, a family finding shelter near a strange rock formation, not knowing they are the first in their line to see it. The footprints are gone now. But the journey remains, hidden in our bones, buried in the language of our DNA. Maybe that is why, even today, humans feel an urge to move, to explore, to search for something beyond the horizon. Perhaps it isn't restlessness. Perhaps it's memory. A memory passed down from a mysterious ape who once looked at an unfamiliar landscape and decided to take one more step.